Witness this. A French duke kneels in the mud. His hands are bound behind his back with rope. His armor, worth more than a peasant village, is caked with filth. Around him, hundreds of other nobles kneel in the same position, breathing hard through dented visors, waiting for the ransom negotiations to begin. This is how medieval war works. You capture the rich, you return them for gold, everyone profits. The Duke has done this before, from the other side. He knows the rules. Then an English archer walks up behind him with a mallet. The Duke doesn't see it coming. The blow caves in the back of his helmet and he pitches forward into the muck. The archer moves to the next man, and the next. All across the field, archers are doing the same thing, working through the kneeling prisoners like men clearing a forest. Some use knives, stabbing through visors. Some use the mallets they'd carried to drive their stakes into the ground that morning. The nobles scream in French that this is against the laws of war, that this is murder, that God will punish this. The archers don't speak French. They keep swinging. This wasn't a battle anymore. This was pest control. King Henry V of England had given the order. His own knights had refused it, horrified, so he'd turned to the commoners, the archers, the men who had no investment in chivalric codes or ransom economics. They obeyed. In less than an hour, hundreds of disarmed, bound prisoners were butchered in cold blood, their bodies left to bloat beside the men they'd been fighting hours before. The greatest massacre of noble prisoners in medieval history, ordered by a Christian king on the feast day of two saints, and you've probably never heard of it. Because the story we tell about Agincourt leaves this part out. The story we tell is about courage and longbows and St. Crispin's Day speeches. The real story is about mud and math and a king who understood that chivalry was a luxury he couldn't afford. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy the hidden truths of history, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. To understand why that massacre happened, why a king who styled himself the champion of God's justice ordered the butchering of unarmed men, you have to understand what brought two armies to that muddy field in northern France on the morning of October 25th, 1415. You have to understand the lie, the gamble, and the trap. Start with the lie. You know the story of Agincourt. Everyone does. A tiny English army, starving and sick, faces an overwhelming French host. The brave English archers cut down the arrogant French knights. Good triumphs over evil. The underdog wins. Shakespeare wrote a play about it. Laurence Olivier made a film. Kenneth Branagh made another one. The St. Crispin's Day speech has been quoted at business conferences and military academies for generations. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Delete all of it. That story is a public relations campaign that took 500 years to polish. The real Agincourt wasn't a triumph of English virtue over French vice. It was what happens when a functioning system collides with a broken one. The English didn't win because they were braver. They won because they were more desperate, better organized, and willing to do things that polite society pretended couldn't be done. The French didn't lose because they were arrogant. They lost because their kingdom was tearing itself apart, and an army of rivals cannot fight as one. Every comfortable thing you believe about this battle is a comfortable thing someone wanted you to believe. Now, meet the gambler. Henry V of England was 28 years old when he invaded France. He'd been king for only 2 years. His father had seized the throne by force, deposing and probably murdering the rightful king, Richard II. The Lancastrian dynasty sat on a stolen crown, and everyone knew it. Rebellions had plagued his father's reign. Whispers plagued his own. The treasury was empty. The nobles who'd helped his family take power expected payment in lands and titles that didn't exist. And the church was under pressure from religious reformers called Lollards, who questioned everything from papal authority to the real presence in the Eucharist. England in 1415 was a kingdom held together with anxiety and habit. Henry needed a distraction. He needed money. He needed to prove that God favored his bloodline. He needed a war. Look at his face. Not the handsome actor face from the movies, but the actual portrait that survives. Gaunt cheeks, intense, calculating eyes. And if you look closely at his right profile, a scar. When Henry was 16 years old, fighting Welsh rebels at the Battle of Shrewsbury, an arrow struck him in the face. It penetrated 6 inches into his skull, lodging near the back of his head. By every reasonable expectation, he should have died. Instead, a surgeon named John Bradmore invented a new instrument on the spot, a screw-like device that gripped the arrowhead from inside the wound and slowly extracted it over several days. Henry survived. He spent weeks recovering in darkness while his face swelled and healed. This mattered at Agincourt, and not just as a story of toughness. Henry knew in his own flesh what an arrow could do to a man's head. He'd felt the punch of the impact, the alien presence of steel inside his skull, the long agony of extraction. When he built his army around archers, when he counted on arrows to break the French charge, he wasn't theorizing. He was remembering. A man who has survived the worst rarely fears it. But survival wasn't enough. Henry needed victory, the kind of victory that silences doubt and fills treasuries and makes God's favor undeniable. A quick raid wouldn't do it. Capturing a single town wouldn't do it. He needed to humiliate France, to force them into a battle they'd lose, to come home with prisoners worth ransoming and stories worth repeating. He needed a spectacle, so he manufactured one. The invasion plan was aggressive to the point of recklessness. Land in Normandy, capture the port of Harfleur, march across northern France to Calais, English territory, daring the French to stop him. The march was a calculated insult, a king walking through enemy lands like he owned them, proving French weakness with every mile he covered unchallenged. If the French let him go, they'd be humiliated. If they fought him, he'd have his battle. Henry didn't trust in miracles. He engineered conditions where miracles could happen. Now look at the army he brought. 12,000 men, in give or take. Not a vast host, but a precise instrument. And the composition tells you everything. Roughly 9,000 of those men were archers, common men, yeomen and peasants who'd trained with the longbow since childhood, whose skeletons would show the evidence decades later. Enlarged left arms, twisted spines, bone spurs on their fingers from tens of thousands of draws. English law required every able-bodied man to practice archery on Sundays. This wasn't patriotism, it was policy. The crown had spent generations turning the English peasantry into a strategic weapons system. The remaining 3,000 were men-at-arms, knights, and professional soldiers who would hold the center and provide the social legitimacy that medieval armies required. But make no mistake about the math. This was an archer army with a knight decoration. Henry wasn't bringing a traditional force. He was bringing a missile platform that happened to have some hand-to-hand capacity. The French understood this, at least in theory. English archers had slaughtered French knights before, at Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356. Those defeats haunted French military memory, but memory is not the same as adaptation. The French knew archers were dangerous. They simply couldn't accept what that knowledge required them to do, which was to stop fighting the way their entire social order told them to fight. Because here's what the French brought to Agincourt: Modern estimates put the French army somewhere between 20 and 30,000 men. Some chronicles claim higher, but those numbers are propaganda. Call it 25,000, which is conservative but honest. Among them were the greatest names in France: the Duke of Orléans, the Duke of Bourbon, the Duke of Alençon, the Duke of Bar, the Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, the highest military officer in the kingdom. Counts and barons and knights by the hundred, each one armored in steel worth a small fortune, mounted on war horses bred for war, trained since childhood in the arts of lance and sword. This was the concentrated military power of a kingdom. This was supposed to be overwhelming. And yet, the French army had a problem that no amount of armor could fix. It had too many leaders and not enough command. D'Albret was constable, technically supreme, but the dukes outranked him socially and saw no reason to take orders from a man of lesser blood. Each great lord had brought his own retinue, his own supplies, his own ideas about how the battle should unfold. Coordination was a fantasy. Consensus was impossible. When d'Albret suggested they avoid battle and let the English starve, a duke reportedly sneered that he refused to hide from English peasants. That sneer was a death sentence for thousands of men. The French had numbers, they had courage and equipment and every material advantage. What they didn't have was a single functioning brain directing the whole. Henry had 6,000 exhausted men and total control. The French had 30,000 men and a committee. One mind beats many minds. It almost always does. By God's grace we shall have victory, Henry told his men on the eve of battle. But his actions told a different theology. He positioned his archers behind sharpened wooden stakes designed to gut charging horses. He chose ground that narrowed toward his position, turning French numbers into French crowding. He waited for them to come to him, through mud that would tire armored men and slow them into easy targets. Henry didn't pray for miracles. He built a killing box. But to understand why the French walked into that box anyway, why an army of intelligent men made the choice that destroyed them, you have to understand something that has nothing to do with England. You have to understand the war inside France, the hatred between Frenchmen that made a unified defense impossible, and the one man who could have stopped the slaughter but chose to watch instead. Because Agincourt wasn't really England versus France. It was France versus France, and England collected the winnings. You've been told the 100 Years' War was a conflict between England and France. 2 nations, 2 crowns, 1 winner. It makes sense on a map. It fits the story we like to tell about medieval Europe, where kingdoms fought each other in noble contests of arms and destiny. Forget the map. Forget the nations. The 100 Years' War was a French civil war with English shareholders. For nearly a century, English kings had claimed the French throne through tangled bloodlines and convenient marriages. But claiming isn't the same as taking. Every English invasion required French allies, French ports, French nobles willing to open their gates and share intelligence and provide the local knowledge that foreign armies desperately need. The English didn't conquer France. They exploited French divisions. They picked sides in French quarrels. And they showed up when France was bleeding and helped themselves to whatever fell loose. By 1415, France was bleeding worse than it had in generations. The French king, Charles VI, had gone mad. Not metaphorically mad, not politically difficult, but genuinely, catastrophically insane. His episodes began in 1392, when he'd suddenly attacked his own escort during a ride through the forest, killing 4 men before he could be restrained. After that, the breaks came regularly. Sometimes he believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. Sometimes he forgot he was king, forgot his own name, wandered the palace hallways not recognizing the servants who'd attended him for years. Sometimes he was lucid for months, ruling competently, and then the darkness would descend again without warning. His wife eventually stopped visiting his chambers. His children grew up watching their father scream at phantoms. A mad king is not just a personal tragedy, it's a power vacuum, and power vacuums fill with ambitious men. Two factions emerged to control France, while Charles screamed at the walls. The Armagnacs, led by the party of the Duke of Orléans, the king's younger brother, and the Burgundians, led by John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, whose territories in Flanders and the Netherlands made him richer than any other noble in France. These weren't political parties in the modern sense. They were armed camps. They controlled cities, raised armies, collected taxes in the king's name while ignoring the king's wishes. By the early 1400s, they hated each other more than they hated any foreign enemy. In 1407, the hatred became murder. Louis, Duke of Orléans, was walking through Paris on a November evening when a group of armed men stepped out of a doorway. They hacked him apart in the street. 19 wounds to his body. His hand, raised in defense, severed completely. His skull split open, brains spilling onto the cobblestones. The assassins escaped into the night. Within days, everyone knew who had ordered the killing. John the Fearless didn't even bother denying it. He fled Paris, returned with an army, and publicly defended the murder as tyrannicide, the justified killing of a tyrant. A theologian was hired to write a formal argument that Louis had been a threat to the realm and deserved what he got. France didn't punish the murder. France took sides. The next 8 years were civil war. Cities burned, and villages were pillaged by one French army and pillaged again by the other. Peasants died in their thousands, caught between factions that barely remembered why they were fighting. Tax collection collapsed. Roads became hunting grounds for bandits and deserters. The currency was debased until money meant nothing. And all the while, Charles VI sat in his palace, sometimes aware that his kingdom was tearing itself apart, mostly not, while his wife and his sons and his ministers fought each other for the scraps. This was the France that Henry V invaded, not a unified kingdom rallying to defend its soil, a shattered realm where half the nobility would have welcomed English victory if it meant destroying their domestic enemies, and Henry knew it. He'd been watching France bleed for years. His council had contacts in both factions. He understood that an invasion wasn't just a military gamble, it was a political intervention in someone else's civil war, and the timing had never been better. But understanding your enemy's weakness doesn't mean you can ignore their strength. And France, even broken France, remained the most formidable military power in Europe. Consider what the French could put on a battlefield. The French knight of 1415 wore armor that represented 3 centuries of refinement. Full-plate steel, articulated at every joint, designed to deflect blows and distribute impact. A suit weighed between 50 and 70 pounds, but the weight was spread across the entire body, and a trained knight could run, mount a horse, even do cartwheels in his harness. This wasn't the clumsy tin can of popular imagination. This was a masterpiece of metallurgy and ergonomics, fitted precisely to its owner's body, tested and adjusted until it moved like a second skin. The best armor came from Italy and Germany, and a French duke might spend the equivalent of a modern luxury car on a single suit. Now multiply that by thousands. The French army at Agincourt included somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 men-at-arms, each one armored in steel, trained from childhood in mounted combat, supported by squires and servants and spare horses. Behind them came crossbowmen, artillerymen, engineers, and the vast logistical tail that any medieval army required. When the French summoned their forces that autumn, They were calling on the military tradition that had dominated European warfare for 500 years. Heavy cavalry, steel-clad and disciplined, had broken every enemy from the Moors of Spain to the peasant rebellions of Flanders. There was no infantry force in Europe that could stand against a determined cavalry charge. This was not arrogance. This was history, and the French had learned from their earlier defeats. After Crécy, after Poitiers, French commanders had studied what went wrong. They knew English archers were dangerous. They developed tactics to counter them, dismounting knights to avoid the vulnerability of horses, using crossbowmen to suppress archer fire, advancing in tight formations behind shields. They'd even experimented with early gunpowder weapons, crude bombards that could terrify horses and punch through wooden fortifications. The French weren't fools. They were professionals operating within a military culture that had conquered an empire, and they had every reason to believe that professionalism would triumph over a small, sick, foreign army caught deep in hostile territory. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, understood all of this better than anyone. He was the highest military officer in the kingdom, appointed by the king to command in the king's madness, and he had spent his life studying war. When the English landed at Harfleur in August of 1415, d'Albret began assembling the response. Messengers went out to every loyal lord. Supplies were gathered, roads were cleared, bridge crossings were fortified. The constable's strategy was simple and ruthless. Let the English exhaust themselves, shadow their march, deny them supplies, cut off their foraging parties, and wait for hunger and disease to do the work. When they were weak enough, destroy them. If they tried to escape by sea, bottle them up on the coast and starve them into surrender. It was a good plan. It was the right plan, and it would have worked if d'Albret had been allowed to execute it. But d'Albret wasn't really in command. He held the title of constable, but the army assembling to stop Henry included dukes who outranked him socially and saw no reason to follow orders from a man of lesser blood. The Duke of Orléans, the Duke of Bourbon, the Duke of Alençon, the Duke of Bar, each one had brought his own retinue, his own ambitions, his own ideas about how the campaign should unfold. d'Albret could suggest. He couldn't command. When he proposed waiting out the English, letting them starve, the dukes revolted. Are we to hide from peasant archers while they walk across France? The speaker was probably Bourbon or Alençon. The sources don't agree, but the sentiment was universal among the high nobility. These were men who had spent fortunes on armor and war horses, who had trained since childhood for exactly this kind of confrontation, whose entire social status depended on their martial reputation. Letting the English escape without battle wasn't caution. It was cowardice. It was an admission that French chivalry feared English yeomen. The shame would follow them for the rest of their lives. d'Albret knew they were wrong. He'd studied Crécy. He'd read the chronicles. He knew what happened when armored knights charged into prepared archers on ground the archers had chosen. But knowing isn't the same as being heard. In a council of dukes, the constable's voice was one among many, and not the loudest. He made his arguments. He was overruled. The army would force battle on the first favorable opportunity. What d'Albret thought, watching the dukes posture and preen, the chronicles don't record. Perhaps he hoped the terrain would favor a charge. Perhaps he believed French numbers would overwhelm any defense. Perhaps he simply stopped fighting a battle he couldn't win and focused on doing his duty as best he could. He would die in the mud at Agincourt, trampled and suffocated like the knights he couldn't control. The one man who understood the danger, silenced by a system that valued bloodlines over competence. But there was another French voice missing from that council. Another duke, richer than all of them combined, whose army could have doubled the force facing Henry. John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, stayed home. His reasons were entirely logical. The Armagnacs were his enemies. A catastrophic Armagnac defeat would serve Burgundian interests better than any victory. If the cream of Armagnac nobility died on an English battlefield, Burgundy would dominate France for a generation. John didn't need to lift a finger. He just needed to wait. So when the Armagnac lords sent messengers begging for help, when they invoked the defense of the realm and the honor of France, John the Fearless replied with expressions of regret and logistical complications. His army couldn't possibly reach the English in time. His territories needed defending against other threats. He would pray for French victory. He would remain in Dijon. The army that faced Henry at Agincourt was half an army. It was the Armagnac faction alone, already bled by years of civil war, divided by internal rivalries, and commanded by a man whose title exceeded his authority. And across the field stood 6,000 desperate Englishmen, led by a king who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Henry V was not supposed to be king. His father, Henry Bolingbroke, had been an exile and a rebel who seized the throne from his cousin Richard II in 1399. The Lancastrian dynasty was founded on usurpation, and everyone knew it. Young Henry grew up in a court shadowed by doubt, where every ambitious lord calculated whether backing the Lancastrians was worth the risk, where legitimacy was a constant question that could never be answered to everyone's satisfaction. He was a prince, but a prince of a contested house, and his path to power ran through violence. At 14, he commanded troops against Welsh rebels. At 16, he nearly died at Shrewsbury, or an arrow through his face, 6 inches of steel lodged in his skull. The surgeon who saved him, John Bradmore, invented a new tool specifically for the extraction, a set of tongs that screwed into the wooden arrow shaft and pulled it free millimeter by millimeter over the course of several days. Henry survived. He spent weeks in darkness while his face swelled and healed, feeling the cavity where the arrowhead had been, knowing how close he'd come. The scar was visible for the rest of his life. So was the lesson. Henry had felt what an arrow could do. He would build his kingdom around that knowledge. By the time he became king in 1413, he'd spent a decade fighting. Welsh mountains had taught him irregular warfare, siegecraft, the logistics of feeding an army in hostile terrain. His father's rebellions had taught him politics and the constant management of ambitious nobles who needed to be rewarded and watched and occasionally destroyed. He was not a romantic figure. He was a calculating survivor who had learned that power went to those who planned for the worst and acted without hesitation. The invasion of France was not a crusade for glory. It was a business decision. England in 1413 was restless. The nobles who had helped the Lancastrians seize power expected payment in lands and titles. The treasury was empty. Religious reformers questioned the authority of the church, which was the crown's closest ally. Henry needed money. He needed to redirect noble violence outward before it turned inward, and he needed a victory so overwhelming that no one could question God's favor on his dynasty. France offered all three. Ransoming captured French nobles could fill the treasury for a generation. The campaign would give restless lords an outlet for their ambitions, and defeating the French in open battle would prove what all the genealogical arguments never could, that the Lancastrians were God's chosen. But Henry understood that he couldn't win a conventional war against France. Even broken France had more men, more money, more resources than England could ever muster. What he could do was win a battle, the right battle, on the right ground, with the right tools. The longbow was not a weapon, it was a system. Other armies had archers. English archers were different because England had spent a century building a society that produced them. Statutes required every able-bodied yeoman to own a bow and practice every Sunday. Villages held competitions. The best archers earned status and wages that elevated them above common laborers. When the crown called for archers, it didn't recruit raw peasants and hand them equipment. It summoned men who had been training since childhood, whose bodies had literally reshaped around the demands of the draw. The longbow required a pull of 100 to 150 pounds. That meant years of conditioning, specific muscle development, skeletal adaptations that archaeologists can still see in excavated remains. Archer skeletons show enlarged left arms, thickened finger bones, spinal curvature from the repeated stress of the draw. These weren't soldiers. They were athletes, specialists, human weapon platforms that couldn't be improvised or quickly trained. A knight could be equipped in months. An archer took a decade. Well, Henry brought roughly 5,000 of these men to France. Each one carried a bow, a sword, a mallet, and 2 sheaves of arrows, 48 shafts in a linen bag. Resupply arrows came on carts in the baggage train, tens of thousands more, because Henry knew what would happen if he got the battle he wanted. At extreme range, an archer could loose perhaps 6 aimed shots per minute. In the chaos of close combat, when accuracy mattered less than volume, the rate could double. 5,000 archers loosing 12 arrows per minute for the 2 or 3 minutes of a cavalry charge meant somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 arrows in the air. Not a volley, a storm. Henry didn't need to outfight the French. He needed to make them come to him through terrain of his choosing, it into a prepared position where his archers could turn numbers into a liability. The French had more men. That meant more targets. And if he could funnel them into a narrow space where they couldn't deploy, where they crowded and stumbled and blocked each other, then the mathematics of slaughter favored the smaller force. This was the gamble he carried across the Channel. Harfleur was supposed to fall quickly. It held for 5 weeks. Dysentery swept through the English camp, killing more men than combat, thinning Henry's army from 12,000 to perhaps 6,000 still able to fight. Every day of delay made the situation worse. The campaigning season was ending. French armies were mobilizing. The window for returning to England before winter was closing. Henry's commanders urged him to sail home from Harfleur, declare victory, and return the next year with a fresh army. It was the sensible choice. It was what any reasonable king would do. Henry refused. "We will march to Calais," he told his council, "through the heart of France. Let them stop us if they can." This was not courage. This was calculation masked as courage. Returning home with only Harfleur would look like failure, and Henry couldn't afford failure. He needed the march, needed the provocation, needed France to either let him walk unchallenged across their territory, which would be humiliation, or to force the battle that might kill him but would certainly make his legend. The army left Harfleur on October 8, 1415. 6,000 men, many still weak from dysentery, carrying 8 days of food for a march that would take more than 2 weeks. Ahead of them lay 260 miles of hostile territory, swollen rivers with burned bridges, and a French army growing larger every day. Behind them, the gates of Harfleur swung shut. There was no going back. The French tracked Henry's march like wolves following a wounded deer. D'Albret kept his forces between Henry and Calais, shadowing, blocking river crossings, forcing detours that ate time and supplies. The English food ran out. Men foraged for hazelnuts and unripe grapes. Dysentery continued to kill. The army that had landed as a coherent force began to fray into a column of exhausted scarecrows, held together only by the knowledge that stopping meant dying. On October 24th, 17 days after leaving Harfleur, the English found their road blocked. The French had finally chosen their ground in a narrow field between two dense forests in the commune of Agincourt. There was no way around. There was no retreat that wouldn't become a rout. Henry's gamble had worked perfectly. He had forced the battle he needed. Now he had to survive it. The rain began on October 24th and didn't stop. Henry's army reached the field at Agincourt in the late afternoon, soaked to the bone, having marched through mud that sucked at their boots and turned the road into a canal. Ahead of them, blocking the route to Calais, the French army spread across the landscape like a steel tide. Banners by the hundred, pavilions being erected, the sound of thousands of horses and the clatter of armor being adjusted, tested, prepared. Even from a distance, the English could see what they were facing. This wasn't a blocking force, so this was the military power of France assembled in one place, and it was waiting for them. Henry ordered his men to halt. They made camp in an orchard and some gardens near the village of Monstrelet, perhaps 1,000 yards from the French position. There was no question of retreat. The army was too weak, the French too close. There was no question of bypassing the enemy and racing for Calais, not through muddy terrain with cavalry ready to run them down. The only way forward was through. That night, Henry walked among his men. The chronicles agree on this, though they disagree on what he said. Some report speeches, encouragements, reminders of God's favor. Others describe something quieter, a king simply being seen, moving from fire to fire, letting the soldiers know that he was there and that he would be there in the morning. The effect was the same either way. These men had marched 260 miles with their king. They had starved with him, shat blood with him, watched their friends die of disease in ditches while the same king knelt beside them. Whatever else Henry was, he had earned something that night that money couldn't buy. The French spent the evening rather differently. In the pavilions across the field, the nobility of France gambled for the prisoners they expected to take. Lists were drawn up of which English lords would fetch the highest ransoms. Servants prepared fresh horses and polished armor until it gleamed. There was laughter in the French camp, the sound of confidence, of men who saw the morning as a formality before the celebration. They had been waiting for this. The English were trapped, exhausted, and outnumbered at least 4-1. Tomorrow would not be a battle. Tomorrow would be a harvest. The rain kept falling. It had been falling for days, and the field between the two armies was not a meadow or a pasture. It was recently plowed farmland, wheat fields turned over for the winter planting, and the water had nowhere to go. By morning, the ground would be a swamp. This mattered more than anyone realized. Henry understood terrain. Years of fighting in Wales had taught him to read ground the way a merchant reads a ledger. He knew what hills could hide, what rivers could block, what forests could do to cavalry. And standing at the edge of that field on the evening of October 24th, he saw something the French either didn't see or refused to consider. The field between Agincourt and Tramecourt was shaped like a funnel. Two forests, dense enough to block any movement, narrowed the open ground from perhaps 1,200 yards at the French end to maybe 300 yards near the English position. Any force advancing across that field would be compressed as it moved, squeezed tighter, and tighter by the tree lines, unable to spread out or flank. The wider your army, the worse this problem became, and the French army was very, very wide. Henry chose his position at the narrow end of the funnel. His 5,000 archers would form two wings, angled slightly forward, creating a kill zone where arrows could fly from 3 directions at once. The 900 men-at-arms would hold the center, a thin line of steel to receive whatever survived the arrows. And each archer would carry, in addition to his bow and his sheaves of arrows, a sharpened wooden stake roughly 6 feet long. The stakes were Henry's insurance. Plant them in the ground in front of your position, points angled outward, and cavalry becomes impossible. A charging horse will not impale itself willingly. The animals would balk, rear, throw their riders, mill in confusion while arrows fell. Henry had seen this work in Wales, where the terrain forced similar adaptations. He was taking Welsh mountain tactics and applying them to a French wheat field. But tactics only work if the enemy cooperates. And as night fell on October 24th, Henry faced a problem. The French weren't moving. D'Albret's strategy was still in effect, at least partially. The constable had positioned his army to block the English advance, but he had no intention of attacking prepared positions. He would wait. Time favored the French. Every hour the English stood in the mud was an hour they grew weaker. Every night without food was a night that sapped their strength for combat. If the English wanted to reach Calais, they would have to come forward and attack, abandoning their defensive position and advancing into the teeth of French numbers. D'Albret could afford patience. Henry could not. The standoff lasted through the night and into the morning. Dawn broke gray and wet, the rain finally tapering to a cold drizzle, and both armies formed their lines. Then they stood there. For 3 hours, perhaps 4, nothing happened. Knights checked their armor for the 10th time. Archers flexed their fingers against the cold. Horses stamped and snorted, and still, no movement. Henry watched the French line and calculated. His men were dying on their feet. Not dramatically, not visibly, but the cumulative weight of exhaustion and hunger and illness was crushing them by degrees. They couldn't stand in formation forever. They couldn't maintain readiness without collapse. The French could rotate fresh troops forward, could feed their soldiers from abundant supplies, could wait until the English simply fell down. If this became a siege, Henry lost. If this became a test of endurance, Henry lost. He needed a battle, today, now, while his men still had the strength to fight one. But attacking was suicide. Advancing across that open ground into French numbers meant abandoning every advantage the position offered. It meant archers walking through mud toward cavalry, stakes left behind, the funnel working in reverse. It was exactly what the French wanted. Henry chose a third option. He ordered his army to advance, but not to attack. The entire English line pulled up stakes, moved forward roughly 400 yards, and planted stakes again. They stopped just within extreme longbow range of the French position and reformed their line. This was the most dangerous moment of the battle, and it happened before any blow was struck. For the 10 or 15 minutes it took to advance and reset, the English were vulnerable. No stakes in the ground, men stumbling through mud with equipment, archers unable to shoot while carrying their stakes. If the French had charged during that window, the battle would have ended then and there, a rout with no defense. The French didn't charge. By the time their commanders recognized what was happening, processed the opportunity, and tried to organize a response, the window had closed. The English were set, stakes planted, and archers knocking arrows, and now they were close enough to shoot. Henry had baited the trap. He had moved just close enough to force a French response while still holding ground that favored defense. The French could no longer wait. English arrows were about to start falling. They had to advance or retreat, and retreat was unthinkable. The French advanced, but the army that began moving across that muddy field was not a unified force executing a coherent plan. It was a collection of egos in steel, each one determined to be first into glory. Jean II Le Mangre, called Boucicaut, was the Marshal of France, theoretically second in command to d'Albret. He had fought in crusades, won tournaments across Europe, written a book on chivalry that was read in every noble court. He was 60 years old and had been preparing for battles like this since before Henry was born. Boucicaut understood that charging across mud into prepared archers was exactly what the English wanted. He argued for caution, for a flanking movement through the forests, for anything other than a frontal assault. He was overruled. He would fight in the second line, dismounted, walking through the carnage the first line left behind. Charles, Duke of Orléans, was 20 years old and nominal commander of the first French battle line. His father had been murdered by John the Fearless in that Paris street 8 years before. Charles had spent his youth plotting revenge, building alliances, preparing for the day when he would destroy the Burgundians and restore his family's honor. He had not come to Agincourt to hang back while others won glory. He would fight in the front rank, armored in the finest plate Milan could produce, surrounded by his household knights. He would survive the battle, barely. He would spend the next 25 years as a prisoner in England, writing poetry in captivity, his ransom too high for ruined France to pay. By the time he came home, his youth would be gone, and his cause forgotten. The Duke of Alençon commanded a portion of the first line with a reputation for reckless courage that bordered on stupidity. He would charge directly at Henry's position, trying to reach the king himself, trying to end the battle with a single blow. He would get close. He would die trying. The Duke of Brabant arrived late, riding hard to reach the field in time. He had no proper armor, so he improvised a surcoat from a banner, a trumpet banner cut and draped over his shoulders. He threw himself into the fight with the fury of a man who'd almost missed his chance for immortality. The immortality he found was a shallow grave. These were the men who would lead the French assault, champions of their age, heirs to fortunes that dwarfed English kingdoms, armored in steel that represented the pinnacle of medieval technology. They were also a committee, each one jealous of his prerogatives, none willing to subordinate his glory to another's plan. D'Albret watched them form up and knew what was coming. He had done everything he could. He had argued for patience, for strategy, for anything other than this headlong charge into the teeth of prepared defenses. He had been ignored, overruled, dismissed as a man of insufficient noble blood to understand what honor required. Now he would die alongside the men who hadn't listened. The French plan, such as it was, called for a coordinated assault. Cavalry on the wings would sweep around and attack the English archers from the flanks, disrupting their fire and creating chaos. The dismounted men-at-arms in the center would advance in 3 successive waves, each one building on the progress of the last, overwhelming the thin English line through sheer mass. Crossbowmen would provide covering fire. Artillery would terrify the English horses. None of this would happen. The cavalry wings had been reduced at the last minute, possibly because the horses couldn't be controlled in the mud, possibly because noble commanders refused to let their precious mounts be risked in preliminary skirmishing. Instead of several thousand horsemen on each wing, there were perhaps 300 on one side and 400 on the other. not enough to flank anyone, just enough to die impressively. The crossbowmen were positioned behind the men-at-arms, which meant they couldn't shoot without hitting their own troops. Someone had apparently decided that their job was to finish off survivors after the knights had won, which was optimistic to the point of delusion. The artillery never fired. Possibly it was too wet. Possibly no one gave the order. Possibly it was facing the wrong direction. The chronicles disagree, and the guns themselves contributed nothing to the outcome. What remained was a mass of armored men preparing to walk across 800 yards of sucking mud into a storm of arrows. No flank attack to distract the archers. No suppressive fire to keep English heads down. No cavalry shock to break the line before the slaughter began. Just men in steel moving forward, trusting that courage and numbers would carry them through. The French formation was magnificent. Thousands of knights in polished armor, banners snapping in the cold wind. The hereditary power of a kingdom assembled in ranks that stretched wider than the field could comfortably hold. They filled the space between the forests, a wall of steel 3 or 4 men deep at the front, more masses behind waiting their turn, and that was exactly the problem. The funnel geometry that Henry had chosen worked like this. The French started wide and had to compress as they advanced. Men who began with room to move found themselves shoulder to shoulder as the tree lines squeezed inward. The deeper ranks pushed forward into the men ahead. Formation spacing collapsed. What should have been lines became crowds. In a cavalry charge, this matters less. Horses create their own spacing, and the shock of impact happens too quickly for crowding to become crushing. But the French were advancing on foot, slowly, through mud that grabbed at their ankles and turned every step into labor. The compression was gradual, relentless, and lethal. By the time they reached the English line, many of them wouldn't be able to raise their arms. Henry saw them begin to move. Across 800 yards of churned earth, the greatest concentration of military nobility Europe had ever produced began walking toward his starving archers. The English had done the math too. Every man in that line knew what was coming across the field. Every man understood that if those steel-clad figures reached their position with enough strength to fight, the thin English line would be swept away like chaff. The battle would be decided in the next few minutes, one way or another. Henry gave the order. The accounts vary on the exact words. Some say he cried, "Now strike." Others record, "Loose," or simply, "In the name of God." 5,000 archers drew. The first arrows rose into the gray October sky, arced, and fell toward the advancing French like a plague of hornets descending from heaven. This was the moment everything changed. The French cavalry went first. Those few hundred horsemen on each wing spurred forward, trying to reach the archers before the storm could build. They were supposed to be thousands. They were barely enough to make a line. And they were riding into a narrowing gap where arrows flew from 3 directions at once. A horse is not a small target. At 200 yards, longbow arrows could wound and panic even an armored destrier. At 100 yards, they could kill. The cavalry charge covered perhaps 300 yards before it began to come apart. Horses screamed and fell, throwing riders into the mud. Unwounded horses shied away from the wall of stakes, refusing to impale themselves despite spurs and whips. Knights who stayed mounted found themselves isolated, surrounded by archers who had dropped their bows and drawn mallets, methodically knocking riders from saddles and killing them in the mire. The cavalry charge, the shock action that was supposed to protect the infantry advance, lasted less than 5 minutes. It accomplished nothing except adding horse carcasses to the obstacles the infantry would have to cross. Behind them, the mass of dismounted knights kept coming. The arrow storm shifted to the center. 5,000 bows, 10 to 12 arrows per minute. a curtain of steel-tipped shafts falling into a target that couldn't spread out and couldn't retreat. The French raised their shields, lowered their heads, and kept walking. They had trained for this. They believed their armor would protect them. Many of them were right. Plate steel deflected most arrows at range. The shafts glanced off curved surfaces, stuck in padding, failed to penetrate. But some arrows found gaps, visors, armpits, the backs of knees, and even arrows that didn't penetrate still hit with crushing force, staggering men, knocking them off balance in the treacherous mud. Here and there, knights fell and didn't rise. The men behind them stumbled over the bodies, their own formation disrupted by casualties they couldn't see through slotted visors already clogging with mud. The French kept coming. They were close now. 200 yards. 100. The archers could see faces through the visors, mouths open with exertion, eyes fixed forward. The arrow volleys increased in tempo, every archer loosing as fast as he could draw, the sky dark with shafts, and still the French advanced. This was the moment Henry had feared and planned for, the moment when arrows weren't enough, the moment when armored men reached his line and the real killing began. The English men-at-arms braced. Behind them, archers dropped bows and picked up mallets, hatchets, swords, anything that could kill a man in armor. The thin line of 900 knights and men-at-arms was about to receive the impact of several thousand French warriors who had survived the worst the longbows could do. But the French who reached the English line weren't the same men who had started across the field. They had walked 800 yards through mud that sucked at their feet. They had climbed over dead horses and fallen comrades. They had been battered by a storm of arrows that, even when it didn't penetrate, had hit them with the force of thrown rocks, again and again and again. Their visors were clogged with mud. Their arms were heavy from holding shields up. Many of them could barely breathe, their lungs burning from exertion inside steel coffins that trapped heat and restricted airflow. And they had been compressed. The funnel had done its work. What started as a formation with room to swing a sword had become a crowd pressed body to body, men unable to raise their arms because other men were pushed against them, ranks shoving into ranks as the mass behind forced the mass ahead into an ever-narrowing space. The first French knights reached the English stakes and couldn't stop. The men behind pushed them forward. Stakes punched into armor, into flesh, into the tangled mass of bodies that was no longer an army, but a crush. Men fell and were trampled by the men behind them, pushed down into the mud by the weight of their own comrades, armor that had protected them now holding them down as the mire swallowed their faces. The English line didn't break. It didn't even bend. There wasn't enough French momentum left to bend it. The charge had been absorbed by mud and arrows and compression, and what reached the English position was not a wave of steel-clad warriors, but a struggling mass of exhausted men who could barely stand, let alone fight. Henry's gamble had paid off. The geometry of slaughter had worked exactly as he'd planned. Now came the killing. The sky cleared just before noon. After 2 days of rain, the clouds broke apart and weak October sunlight fell across the field, catching the polished steel of the French vanguard and turning it into a blinding wall. From the English position, it looked like a wave of light was preparing to crash into them. The French had dressed for glory. Their armor gleamed. Their surcoats displayed the colors of every great house in France. Banners marked the positions of dukes and counts and barons, and snapping in the cold wind like declarations of intent. The English looked like what they were, scarecrows in rusted mail, faces hollow from weeks of dysentery and short rations, leather armor dark with rain and sweat, and the grime of a 260-mile march. No gleaming plate. No proud banners, save for Henry's own standards marking the center. Just a thin line of desperate men behind sharpened sticks, watching an army 5 times their size begin to move. The French drums started first, a deep, rhythmic pounding that carried across the muddy ground and settled into the chest like a second heartbeat. Then the horns, brass notes cutting through the morning air, signaling the advance. The wall of steel began to walk. Henry stood at the center of his line, surrounded by his household knights. He wore a crowned helmet, in a gold circlet fixed to the steel, so that every man on the field could identify him. This was deliberate. The helmet made him a target, and Henry knew it. French knights would be drawn to him like moths to flame, fighting each other for the honor of capturing or killing an English king. That was fine. Let them come. Every man trying to reach Henry was a man not cutting through the archers on the wings. The first arrows rose when the French were still 300 yards out. Not the full storm yet, just ranging shots, archers testing the distance and the wind. The shafts arced high and fell among the advancing ranks, most glancing off armor, a few finding gaps. Here and there, a man stumbled. The mass kept moving. At 200 yards, Henry gave the signal. 5,000 archers drew as one, in the creak of yew and the rustle of feathers audible even over the drums. Then they loosed. The sky darkened. It's hard to describe what 100,000 arrows in 2 minutes looks like, because nothing in modern experience prepares you for it. Imagine hail, but the hailstones are steel-tipped and falling at 150 feet per second. Imagine a sound, like tearing fabric, magnified to the scale of a thunderstorm, punctuated by impacts that rang off armor like a blacksmith shop gone mad. Imagine trying to walk through that, knowing that any step might be the one where a shaft finds the gap in your visor, or the joint at your elbow, or the back of your knee. The French walked through it. They had no choice. Stopping meant standing still in the arrow storm. Retreating meant showing their unprotected backs, and the only way out was forward, through the steel rain, trusting their armor and their courage and the fact that the English couldn't possibly have enough arrows to kill them all. The armor held, mostly. Plate steel at this range deflected most direct hits, sending arrows skittering away in showers of sparks. But the impacts hammered into men's bodies like punches, staggering them, breaking their rhythm, wearing them down step by step. And some arrows found their marks. A knight named Jean de Verchamp, seneschal of Hainaut, took a shaft through his visor at 200 yards and pitched forward into the mud. He was one of the first. He would not be one of the last. The cavalry charge came next, what was left of it. On the French right, perhaps 300 horsemen spurred forward, are trying to reach the English archers before the volleys could build to full intensity. They were supposed to be thousands. They were barely enough to form a line 3 ranks deep. But they were mounted knights on armored destriers, and the ground shook as they accelerated toward the English left wing. The archers shifted aim. 3,000 bows concentrated on 300 horses, and the mathematics were merciless. At 150 yards, arrows began to punch through horse armor. At 100 yards, animals started to scream. The charge didn't hit the English line so much as dissolve in front of it. Horses rearing and falling, riders thrown into mud that grabbed them and held them down, the survivors milling in confusion as their mounts refused to impale themselves on the sharpened stakes. And Sir Thomas Erpingham commanded the archers on that wing. He was an old man by medieval standards, in his late 50s, a veteran of campaigns stretching back decades. He had positioned his men perfectly, angled to create overlapping fields of fire, and now he watched his work unfold with professional satisfaction. When the cavalry charge broke, he reportedly threw his baton into the air and shouted a single word: "Now!" The archers dropped their bows, drew their secondary weapons, and waded into the chaos. Knights who moments before had been thundering forward on half-ton war horses now found themselves on foot, stuck in mud, surrounded by peasants with mallets. The social order of medieval warfare inverted in an instant. The great men of France were being butchered by commoners who didn't know their names and wouldn't have cared if they did. The cavalry on the French left fared no better. Their charge carried them into the same funnel, the same arrow storm, the same wall of stakes. Within 10 minutes, both flanking attacks had been destroyed. The carefully planned envelopment that was supposed to protect the infantry advance had become a preliminary massacre that added horse carcasses to the obstacles the foot soldiers would have to cross. The main French line kept coming. They were closer now, close enough for the English to see individual faces through visors, close enough to hear French voices shouting encouragement over the whistle of arrows. The mud was taking its toll. Men who had started the advance in ordered ranks were now stumbling through a morass churned by thousands of feet, climbing over dead horses and fallen comrades, their formation dissolving into a crowd. The tree lines on either side compressed them further with every step. What had been a broad front was becoming a dense mass. Men pressed shoulder to shoulder, unable to spread out, unable to use their numbers. A knight in the French front rank, later identified as the Sire de Croix, reached the English stakes and couldn't stop. The men behind him pushed him forward, and a sharpened point took him through the gap between breastplate and tasset, driving into his abdomen. He hung there for a moment, suspended on the wood, before the weight of the men behind him snapped the stake and carried him into the English line. He was dead before he hit the ground, but his body became an obstacle that the next wave had to climb. The collision, when it came, was nothing like the romances described. There was no clash of champions, no formal challenge, no moment where brave knights faced each other with honor and dignity. There was simply a mass of exhausted men in steel shells slamming into a thin line of equally exhausted men, everyone too cramped to swing a proper blow, too pressed to retreat, too committed to do anything but push and stab and try to stay upright in the churning mud. The English men-at-arms held. 900 knights and professional soldiers, braced behind their own line, took the impact of several thousand French warriors and did not break. They couldn't advance. They couldn't retreat. They could only stand there and kill whatever came within reach. Swords were useless in the press, too long to swing, too awkward in the crowd. This was dagger work now, close and brutal. Men grabbing opponents and shoving blades through visors or into armpits or up under skirts of mail into groins. The sound was metal on metal, screaming, the wet suck of mud, and above it all, the endless hammer of arrows still falling into the French rear ranks. Henry fought in the center. The gold crown on his helmet drew attackers like a beacon, just as he'd intended. French knights struggled through the press to reach him, each one certain that killing or capturing the English king would end the battle and make their fortune. They came in ones and twos, already exhausted from the advance, and Henry's household guard cut them down with methodical efficiency. The king himself killed at least one man personally, the chronicles agree, though they dispute the details. He fought with a pollux, the weapon of choice for armored combat on foot, a 4-foot shaft topped with an axe blade on one side and a hammerhead on the other. The hammer punched through helmets. The axe carved through mail. Henry was 28 years old, trained in weapons since childhood, fighting for his life and his kingdom. He was very good at this. The Duke of Alençon found him. Through the chaos of the melee, past the bodies and the screaming and the mud that was now slick with blood, Alençon had cut his way toward the royal standard. He had sworn to reach the English king, to end this battle with a single blow, and he was close now, close enough to see the crowned helmet, close enough to swing. His blade struck Henry's head with enough force to shear off a piece of the crown. The king staggered. For one terrible moment, the English line seemed to hold its breath. If Henry fell, if the king died here in the mud, everything would collapse. The exhausted men would break. The French would swarm forward. The gamble would have failed. Henry didn't fall. He caught himself, turned, and faced Alençon. The Duke raised his sword for a killing blow and never completed it. English knights swarmed him from 3 sides. He went down under a storm of blades, his armor hacked apart, his blood mixing with the mire. By the time the English were done, there wasn't enough left of the Duke of Alençon to ransom. 18 of Henry's household guard died in that scrum. One of them, the Duke of York, was the highest-ranking English casualty of the entire battle. He was found dead near the king's position, his helmet beaten in, his body unmarked by wounds. He had probably suffocated in the press, knocked down and trampled, his armor holding his face in the mud until he drowned in it. This was how men died at Agincourt, not in glorious single combat, but in the crush, pushed down by the weight of bodies, held in the mud by their own armor, drowning in inches of bloody water while men fought over their heads. The chronicles describe a wall of corpses building at the point of contact, a rampart of dead and dying that the living had to climb to reach the enemy. Men who fell at the bottom of that pile never rose. Men who fell at the top had perhaps a few seconds to claw their way out before the next wave buried them. When Charles d'Albret, Constable of France, died somewhere in that wall. The chronicles don't record his final moments because no one saw them. He was simply found afterward, among the common dead, his rank meaningless in the democracy of the pile. The one man who had predicted this disaster, who had warned against it, who had been overruled by dukes too proud to listen, ended up face down in the mud like every other corpse. There was no death speech. There was no final stand. There was just the pressure of bodies and the sucking of the mire, and then nothing. The French second line reached the battle perhaps 20 minutes after the first. They had watched the vanguard advance, watched it compress and stumble and crash into the English position. They had seen the arrow storm, seen the cavalry charges dissolve, seen the pile of bodies beginning to build. And they came anyway because there was nothing else to do. Retreat was shame. Waiting was cowardice. Their brothers and cousins and lords were dying a few hundred yards away, and honor demanded they join them. Marshal Boucicaut led them. 60 years old, veteran of 100 fights, the man who had written the book on chivalry. He knew what was coming. He'd argued against it. But when his time came, he put on his helmet and walked into the kill zone like every other knight. The second wave hit the English line with more force than the first, if only because they could use the pile of bodies from the first attack as a ramp. For a few desperate minutes, the English position wavered. Fresh French knights, not yet exhausted by the arrow storm, not yet broken by the crush, pushed into gaps that dead men had left. Henry's line bent. It did not break, but it bent, and in the chaos of hand-to-hand fighting, bending can become breaking in an instant. The archers saved it. With their arrows largely expended, the English bowmen had joined the melee. They carried no armor heavy enough to slow them down. Their weapons were mallets and hatchets, and the short swords called falchions. They were not trained for formal combat, not bound by chivalric rules, not interested in ransoms or honor, or anything except killing as many French knights as possible before they themselves were killed. They went for the men who were down. A knight in full armor, fallen in the mud, is almost helpless. The weight pins him. The visor blinds him. The joints that allow movement also allow entry. The archers worked through the fallen like slaughterhouse workers, methodical and efficient, flipping men onto their backs, lifting visors, and driving daggers into faces. No challenge, no quarter, just production line death at close range. Boucicaut was taken alive, one of the few French commanders to survive the melee. He was worth a fortune in ransom, and the English soldiers who captured him knew it. They hauled him out of the press, stripped him of weapons, bound his hands, and dragged him behind the line. He would spend years in English captivity, his treatise on chivalric virtue mocking him from every prison wall. The Duke of Orléans went down near the center. 20 years old, heir to one of the greatest fortunes in France, he had fought his way toward Henry's standard with the fury of a man avenging his murdered father. Or he didn't reach it. The crush was too thick, the mud too deep, and somewhere in the press, a blow he didn't see knocked him from his feet. He was captured rather than killed, dragged from the pile by English men-at-arms who recognized his coat of arms. He would spend the next 25 years as a prisoner. The Duke of Brabant arrived too late for the first wave and too late for the second. He had ridden hard from his territories, determined to reach the battle in time, and he arrived just as the third French line was preparing to advance. He had no proper armor, so he improvised, cutting a trumpet banner into a surcoat and borrowing whatever protection his entourage could spare. It wasn't enough. He charged into the melee with the third wave and died there, killed by men who probably didn't know they had just butchered a duke, and the third wave was the weakest. Many of the men who should have formed it had already pushed forward to join the second attack. Others, seeing the carnage ahead, had begun to quietly drift away, their horses walking backward, their resolution failing. What reached the English line was not a wave at all, just scattered groups of men still willing to die for honor, still believing that one more push might break through. They were wrong. By early afternoon, the French attack had exhausted itself. Thousands of men lay dead or dying in the mud. Thousands more had been captured, their hands bound, their armor stripped, their dreams of glory reduced to calculating how their families would raise their ransoms. The French rearguard, the men who should have been the reserve, the final hammer blow that would shatter the English line, and never advanced at all. They stood at the far end of the field, watching, and when it became clear that there would be no victory today, they withdrew, not routed, not broken, just finished. Henry's line still held. The thin row of exhausted men who had stood all morning, who had taken the impact of an army and held their ground, were still standing. They couldn't believe it. Some of them couldn't even stand anymore, collapsing where they had fought, too tired to take another step. They had won. Against every calculation, against every expectation, against the finest military force in Europe, they had won. And then the shouting started. A French force was attacking the English baggage train. The camp, lightly defended by pages and servants, was under assault. Rumors spread through the exhausted English ranks like fire. French cavalry was circling behind them. The prisoners would be freed. The battle wasn't over. Henry heard the reports and made his calculation. He had perhaps 600 men still able to fight. He had several thousand prisoners, bound but not incapacitated, many of them still wearing pieces of armor. If the prisoners rose up, if they grabbed weapons from the dead, If they coordinated with an attack from the rear, the English would be overwhelmed. The victory would become a disaster. He gave the order that would define his legacy more than any speech. Kill them. Kill them all. The words fell into silence. His own knights stared at him. This wasn't done. Prisoners were worth fortunes. Prisoners were protected by the laws of war. Killing bound, unarmed men was murder, plain and simple, and the kind of act that damned souls and destroyed reputations. Henry didn't flinch. He repeated the order. The knights refused. They wouldn't do it, couldn't do it, wouldn't sacrifice their honor and their profits for a rumor of an attack that might not even be real. So Henry turned to the archers. The archers had no ransoms to lose. The archers had no chivalric code to violate. The archers had spent the morning killing French knights and would happily spend the afternoon doing the same. They obeyed. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. Hundreds of French prisoners, bound at the wrists, unable to resist, were butchered where they knelt. The archers used the same mallets they'd used all day, the same daggers, the same efficient techniques for killing men in armor. Some prisoners tried to run and were cut down. Some tried to fight and were overwhelmed. Most simply knelt in the mud and died, unable to believe that the rules they'd lived by had stopped applying. The Duke of Brabant, captured in the third attack, was among those killed. So were dozens of other nobles, whose names would later be painstakingly reconstructed from accounts of the dead. The killing went on for perhaps half an hour until word came that the attack on the baggage train was just a local raid, easily repelled, not the coordinated assault Henry had feared. By then, hundreds of men who might have lived were dead. The massacre ended as suddenly as it had begun. Henry called off the archers. Some prisoners still survived, those whose captors had hidden them or refused to participate. Those who had been far enough from the killing grounds to escape notice. But the damage was done. The field of Agincourt, already carpeted with bodies, now included the corpses of men who had surrendered in good faith and been murdered anyway. The sun was setting. The battle had lasted perhaps 3 hours, though it felt like a lifetime to the men who survived it. The English stood among the dead, too exhausted to cheer, too shocked to celebrate. They had won the most lopsided victory in medieval history, and they had done it by breaking every rule of the war they thought they were fighting. Henry walked the field as darkness fell. What he saw was not glory. It was meat. The pile of bodies at the point of contact was higher than a man in places. Layers of steel-clad corpses compressed into a mass that would take days to sort. The men who had been dukes and counts and lords of great estates were indistinguishable from common soldiers, their identities hidden by mud and blood and the democracy of death. The ground was churned into a red-brown soup. Crows were already gathering. The French dead numbered somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000. Among them were 3 dukes, 5 counts, 90 barons, and more than 1,500 knights of noble blood. The command structure of an entire kingdom, the military leadership of a generation, lay rotting in a field in Picardy. The English dead numbered perhaps 400, possibly fewer. Some accounts claim as few as 112. These numbers mattered less than what they represented. The French had believed that courage and armor and noble blood could overcome any obstacle. They had believed that chivalry was a real thing, a code that governed warfare and protected the men who lived by it. They had believed that war had rules. Henry had just proven that it didn't. The survivors gathered near the king's standard as night fell. They were filthy, exhausted, many of them wounded, all of them changed by what they had seen and done. No St. Crispin's Day speech commemorated the victory. no band of brothers celebrated their triumph. They stood in silence and looked at the field where an idea had died. Chivalry, the word wouldn't disappear. Knights would still ride to tournaments. Troubadours would still sing of honor. But something essential had broken that afternoon. Something that couldn't be repaired with words or ceremonies. The French knights had followed every rule and died anyway. The English archers had broken every rule and lived. The lesson was brutal, and Europe would spend the next century learning it. Henry knelt in the mud and prayed. The chronicles describe this moment with various degrees of piety, casting the king as a humble servant of God giving thanks for divine favor. But Henry had just ordered the murder of unarmed prisoners. He had watched his men butcher knights who had surrendered under the laws of God and man. Whatever prayers he offered that evening, they rose from a complicated soul. The night was cold. The English had no food worth eating, no shelter worth using. They slept among the dead, too tired to move the bodies, sharing ground with men they had killed. In the morning, they would march for Calais, carrying their wounded, guarding their prisoners, leaving the French to bury their own. The victory was complete. The cost was still being counted. The morning after the battle, Henry ordered his men to search the dead. This was standard practice. Medieval armies paid themselves through plunder, and the field at Agincourt was the richest harvest most of these soldiers would ever see. French armor alone was worth fortunes. Swords, daggers, rings, chains of office, purses of coin, the accumulated wealth of a generation of nobility lay scattered across the mud, waiting to be collected. The English worked through the bodies systematically, stripping the valuable dead, leaving the worthless ones where they lay. The sorting took most of the day. Heralds from both sides moved among the corpses, identifying the fallen by their coats of arms, recording names for the chronicles that would follow. This was how medieval death was processed, transformed from anonymous meat into entries in genealogical records. The Duke of Bar, dead. The Duke of Brabant, dead. The Duke of Alençon, dead. Charles d'Albret, Constable of France, dead. The list went on for pages. A necrology of the French ruling class, each name representing estates that would pass to widows and children, alliances that would need to be renegotiated, debts that would never be repaid. Henry walked the field with his heralds, surveying what he had accomplished. The chronicles describe him as somber, pious, attributing the victory to God rather than to tactics or fortune. Perhaps he believed it. Perhaps he needed to believe it. The alternative was accepting that he had gambled thousands of lives on a strategy that depended on French incompetence, and that the gamble had paid off only because his enemies were exactly as divided as he'd hoped. Divine favor is easier to live with than dumb luck. The prisoner count revealed the scale of the catastrophe. Between 12 and 1,500 French nobles had been captured, each one worth ransoms that would take years to negotiate. The Duke of Orléans alone was valued at over 100,000 crowns, a sum that would have funded the entire invasion several times over. The Duke of Bourbon, the Marshal Boucicaut, counts and barons by the dozen, all of them now English property. The ransoms from Agincourt would fill English treasuries for a generation. But the count also revealed something else. The massacre of prisoners had not been complete. Hundreds of men who should have been killed had survived, protected by captors who refused to participate, hidden in the chaos, overlooked in the confusion. The order Henry gave had been followed, but not universally, not perfectly. Some of his men had decided in that moment that their souls were worth more than their king's command. Henry never punished them. He never acknowledged the disobedience. The massacre became, in the official chronicle of the campaign, a regrettable necessity. a response to a legitimate threat, quickly ended when the threat proved illusory. The men who had refused were not heroes. They were simply not mentioned. History recorded the order. History forgot who didn't follow it. The march to Calais took 3 more days. The English army, victorious but broken, limped through the countryside with their prisoners and their plunder. They had no food except what they'd taken from French dead. They had no medicine for their wounded except whatever field surgery could provide. Men who had survived the battle died on the march, their bodies left by the road because there was no time to bury them. Henry entered Calais on October 29th, 4 days after the battle. The English garrison, which had spent weeks wondering if they would ever see their king again, turned out to welcome an army that looked more like a column of refugees than a conquering force. The soldiers were skeletal, their armor battered, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and the particular emptiness of men who had seen too much killing. They had won the most celebrated victory in English history. They looked like they had lost everything. The crossing to England took another 2 weeks. Henry landed at Dover on November 16th and began the long, triumphal procession to London. The roads filled with people who had heard the news, who wanted to see the king who had humiliated France, who wanted to touch the armor of the men who had been there. By the time Henry reached the capital, the mythology was already forming. The few against the many, the righteous king against the arrogant enemy. God's favor made manifest on a muddy field. No one mentioned the prisoners kneeling in the mud with their throats cut. No one mentioned the men who had died of dysentery in camp latrines. No one mentioned that the great victory had accomplished nothing strategic, that Harfleur was a single port on a hostile coast, that France remained unconquered and would remain so for years. The celebration was for the story, not the reality, and the story was better. Henry used his victory well. The next 5 years were a masterpiece of diplomatic exploitation. He leveraged Agincourt into alliances, into funding, into a second invasion that was larger and better supplied than the first. He conquered Normandy city by city, siege by siege, grinding down French resistance, while France continued to tear itself apart. In 1420, he achieved what no English king had managed before: the Treaty of Troyes, which named him heir to the French throne. He married Catherine of Valois, daughter of the mad king Charles VI, and began preparing to rule both kingdoms. The gamble had paid off completely. Agincourt had been the crack in the door, and Henry had kicked it open. Then he died. August 31st, 1422. Henry V, King of England, Regent of France, victor of Agincourt, conqueror of Normandy, died at the Château de Vincennes. He was 35 years old. The cause was dysentery, the same disease that had hollowed out his army 7 years before, the same bloody flux that had killed more of his soldiers than French steel ever did. The man who had survived an arrow to the face, who had walked through the slaughter at Agincourt untouched, who had seemed blessed by God himself, was killed by bacteria in his intestines. His son, Henry VI, was 9 months old. Let that sink in. The entire edifice that Agincourt had built, the treaties and the marriages and the carefully constructed claim to 2 crowns, now rested on an infant who couldn't hold a spoon, let alone a kingdom. Henry V had spent his entire reign preparing for a future he would never see, and he left that future in the hands of a baby surrounded by ambitious uncles and scheming nobles and a French kingdom that had every reason to repudiate every promise it had made. The baby would grow into a disaster. Henry VI was gentle where his father had been ruthless, pious where his father had been calculating, prone to episodes of mental illness that echoed the mad grandfather whose throne he'd inherited. He would lose everything his father had won. Normandy, gone. The French crown, gone. Eventually, the English crown too, torn away in the Wars of the Roses that consumed the last half of the 15th century. Henry VI would die in the Tower of London, probably murdered, definitely unmourned, the last of the Lancastrian kings. Agincourt hadn't won a dynasty. It had bought one a generation of borrowed time. But history doesn't remember the boring parts. History remembers the speech, the charge, the impossible odds, the triumph of courage over arrogance. Shakespeare wrote the version that stuck 200 years after the fact, when the political needs of Tudor England required heroic precedence. The St. Crispin's Day speech, those ringing words about brothers and gentlemen and remembered names, was invented by a playwright who had never seen a battle and wouldn't have survived one. It became more real than anything that actually happened on that field. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. The men who actually fought at Agincourt left no such speeches. They left lists of ransoms, petitions for back pay, occasional mentions in legal disputes over who had captured which prisoner. They were professionals doing a job, and the job was killing Frenchmen efficiently enough to survive. The brotherhood was real in the way that shared trauma creates bonds between survivors, but it wasn't noble. It was just the thing that happens when men go through hell together and come out the other side. The French remembered differently. For a generation after Agincourt, French military strategy was shaped by the trauma of that afternoon. The flower of French chivalry, destroyed by peasant archers. The finest armor in Europe, worthless in mud. The commanders who survived, like Boucicaut in his English prison, spent their remaining years trying to understand what had gone wrong. They had done everything right. They had been brave and well-equipped and properly commanded, and they had drowned in a field of wheat. The answer, when it finally came, didn't come from soldiers. It came from a peasant girl who heard voices. Joan of Arc arrived in 1429, 14 years after Agincourt, when the English seemed on the verge of completing Henry V's conquest. She broke the siege of Orléans, led Charles VII to his coronation at Reims, and rallied a France that had almost given up. Her methods were not tactical, they were inspirational. She convinced the French that God was on their side, that the defeats of the past had been tests, that victory was possible if they believed. The French who followed her into battle were not the same men who had walked into the arrow storm at Agincourt. Those men were dead or old or broken. The new generation had grown up with the shame of that defeat, had been told all their lives that French knights couldn't beat English archers, that courage wasn't enough, that something fundamental was broken in the French way of war. Joan told them it wasn't true, and because they believed her, it stopped being true. Joan was captured, tried for heresy, and burned alive in 1431. She was 19 years old. The English hoped her death would break the French resurgence, but it had the opposite effect. She became a martyr, a saint in waiting, proof that God favored France after all. The war that Agincourt was supposed to end dragged on for another 22 years, grinding through sieges and skirmishes and the slow erosion of English positions. When it finally ended, in 1453, the English held nothing in France except Calais. Everything Henry V had won, everything his archers had died for, everything the massacre of prisoners had purchased, was gone. The 100 Years' War ended not with a treaty, but with exhaustion, both kingdoms too depleted to continue, the original causes forgotten in the accumulated wreckage of a century of killing. And Agincourt? Agincourt became a story. The real battle, the mud and the blood and the prisoners with their throats cut, was too ugly for the story people wanted to tell. So it was cleaned up, simplified, transformed into a tale of courage against odds, of faith rewarded, of English virtue triumphant. The parts that didn't fit were quietly dropped. The longbow became a miracle weapon rather than a logistics system. The French became arrogant fools rather than men trapped by politics they couldn't control. Henry became a saint king rather than a calculating gambler who got lucky. The story served England well. It was trotted out whenever the nation needed reminding that small islands could beat continental empires, that plucky determination could overcome material disadvantage. The Armada, Dunkirk, the Blitz. Each crisis found its way back to Agincourt, to that muddy field where everything should have gone wrong and somehow didn't. The myth became load-bearing. Removing it would have meant confronting something uncomfortable, that English victories were often the product of enemy mistakes rather than English virtues. The longbow itself disappeared within a century of its greatest triumph. By 1500, firearms had replaced it in every serious European army. The arquebus was easier to learn, easier to mass-produce, lethal regardless of the user's physique. You didn't need to reshape your skeleton to pull a trigger. England's great weapon system, the advantage that had won Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt, became obsolete because technology moved on. The archers' descendants learned to use guns like everyone else. If you visit Agincourt today, you'll find a quiet village in northern France. The field is still there, still farmed, still shaped roughly the way it was 6 centuries ago. The forests that created the funnel have thinned but not vanished. In the right light, at the right angle, you can almost see how it happened, how the terrain compressed the French advance, how the geometry of slaughter worked. There's a small museum. There are markers and monuments. Every few years, someone with a metal detector finds an arrowhead or a piece of armor, another fragment of the afternoon when an idea died. The ground gives up its secrets reluctantly, a few inches at a time, like corroded steel surfacing through the plow lines like memories that refuse to stay buried. The bodies were never properly accounted for. Mass graves were dug in the days after the battle, French peasants conscripted to bury the French dead, the work too vast for any systematic record. Somewhere beneath that field lie thousands of men who rode to war believing in rules that had governed warfare for 500 years. They believed that armor could protect them, that courage could carry them through, that even if they lost, they would be ransomed and returned to fight again. They believed that war had limits. Henry proved it didn't. That was his true victory. Not the battle itself, not the prisoners or the ransoms or the treaty that followed. His victory was demonstrating with absolute clarity that efficiency beats honor, that systems beat champions, that the side willing to do what the other side considers unthinkable will usually win. The French brought the best version of medieval warfare to that field. The English brought something new, something ruthless, something that didn't care about the old rules because the old rules had never helped the archers' grandfathers. Agincourt wasn't a battle between nations. It was a battle between ideas. The old idea lost. The new idea won. And the new idea is still winning. 6 centuries later, every time someone calculates that breaking the rules is worth more than following them. Henry's body was brought back to England and buried in Westminster Abbey, beneath a tomb that visitors can still see. His effigy shows a handsome face, composed in death, nothing like the gaunt and scarred reality. They crowned him again for the funeral, One last performance of the kingship he had gambled everything to prove. The priests said masses for his soul. The chronicles recorded his virtues. The story was complete. But sometimes late at night, I think about that other scene. Not the triumph, not the speeches, not the St. Crispin's Day mythology. I think about the prisoners kneeling in the mud, bound hands, bowed heads, waiting for ransoms that would never come because a king had decided that efficiency mattered more than honor. And I think about the archers, walking among them with mallets, doing what they were told because they were commoners, and commoners followed orders, and no one had ever taught them that prisoners were sacred. The French who died in that massacre weren't villains. They were men who had played by the rules, surrendered in good faith, and been murdered for it. Their names are mostly lost. The chronicles don't waste ink on men who died with their hands tied. They became footnotes to a story that was already being shaped into something more comfortable, more heroic, more English. History remembers the victory. History forgets the cost. This is what we do with war. We take the blood and the mud and the screaming, and we polish it into something we can live with. We turn massacres into necessities, atrocities into regrettable incidents, crimes into complicated situations. We do it because the alternative is admitting that our heroes weren't heroes at all, that they were men making brutal calculations in brutal moments, and that the things we celebrate were often the things we should mourn. Henry V won at Agincourt. He broke the French army. He captured a generation of their nobility and proved that a smaller force with better tactics could destroy a larger force with better equipment. He also ordered the murder of unarmed prisoners and called it military necessity. Both things are true. Both things are part of the same man, the same victory, the same history. The field at Agincourt is peaceful now. The mud has dried. The blood has long since washed away. If you stand there in the autumn, when the light is right, you can hear nothing but wind and crows and the distant sound of tractors. There is no echo of the screaming. There is no trace of the steel rain. There is only quiet and the knowledge that beneath your feet, 6 centuries of silence is keeping a secret. Thousands of men walked into this field believing they knew how war worked. They were wrong, and the field remembers, even if we don't. If you made it this far, you've seen the story behind the story, the mud beneath the myth. Here's my question. Whose side would you have been on that afternoon? Not which army, that's easy. Which idea? The one that played by the rules or the one that won? Tell me in the comments. And if you want to see another myth dismantled, hit subscribe. The next one's worse.